The snow fell on the road like the silence after a scream, thick and sticky, as if trying to cover everything that wasn't supposed to be seen. The old bus stopped with a quiet hiss, and in the thickening evening air she appeared. An elderly woman in a heavy grey coat, leaning on a battered cane, with a leash held in her thin, slightly trembling hand. An old dog walked beside her, a golden mongrel with intelligent, dull eyes and calloused paws, like a reflection of its owner. On the nameplate of the collar, the inscription was engraved silver. Belle, medical dog, do not touch. In the woman's pocket was a greasy envelope containing a 3-night advance payment at the Ridgeway Inn, a modest but clean place on the edge of town where she had come not to vacation, not on business, not for a wedding, but to bury her sister, the last person who knew her maiden name. Louise had no husband, no children, no friends, just Belle, and a silence that no one else looked into. The drive had been long, the bus stuffy, the people indifferent, and all she wanted now was a simple room, water for the dog, and a chance to be alone for at least one night before the next morning came, filled with grave music, the priest's terse words, and the looks that made even the dead uncomfortable. She stopped at the entrance to the hotel. The tall glass doors slid open automatically with a soft clang. It was warm inside and smelled of chemicals. Belle crossed the threshold first, jerking toward the reception as if she knew where to go. A young guy with a flame tattoo on his neck was standing bored at the counter. His gaze slid over Louise, then stopped at the dog, narrowed. Not hostile, but cold. She handed over the paperwork, silently, politely, as she had done thousands of times when she travelled around the country for nursing conferences. Now all she had left was her memory, and a form confirming that Belle was a service dog, trained to help with panic attacks and episodes of disorientation. The guy slowly took the paperwork, glanced at the monitor, made a couple of clicks with the mouse, and, without raising his head, said, "Room 514, elevator on the left." But before she left, he added, in the same impersonal voice, "With a dog, in the room. Not in the corridors, not in the hall. Violate, we'll evict you." He didn't look at her. No one looked at her. She nodded. She thanked him. The dog looked him in the eye, straight, attentive. He jerked his hand away, as if he sensed that this look had a name. The elevator creaked, rose, and the woman and the dog, who had disappeared into it, became part of the hotel system, the one that could tolerate but not care. The room was small but warm, a narrow bed with snow-white linens, a lamp by the wall, a TV without a remote control, and an old air conditioner, humming like an old bee. Belle settled at the foot of the bed, and Louise finally allowed herself to exhale. Her sister had died of a stroke in her sleep, but not before leaving a voice message that Louise had listened to 20 times already. "Lou, come over. I feel like I'm leaving. I'm sorry. I missed you." The words echoed in every corner of the room, although she had not turned on the phone. She just sat there, stroking Belle's fur, thinking how strange it was that there was only one dog left in the world who hadn't abandoned her. Someone was laughing behind the wall. There was a commercial on TV. A door slammed somewhere. But all of this faded into the distance until she fell asleep, her forehead buried in a cold hand. It was quiet in the morning. Suspiciously quiet. Belle got up first, went to the door, and growled, barely audibly. Louise opened her eyes, and at that very moment there was a knock on the door. Strangely polite. She went over, opened it, and saw a woman in uniform with a badge, Crystal. Crystal's lips were stretched into a smile, but her eyes were prickly. "Hello. We have received a complaint about barking from your room. We would like to remind you that the rules clearly state the animal must be in a carrier," she said. "My dog does not bark, and she is a service dog." "Here is a certificate," Louise said, handing over the paper again. Crystal glanced at him, and as if she hadn't seen him, turned on her heel. "Next time, a warning. Then eviction," she said over her shoulder. The door slammed shut. Louise went back to bed. Belle jumped up to her, licking her palms. She wasn't angry. She'd gotten used to it. The world hadn't changed, only the masks had. During the day, she'd gone to a rehearsal for the ceremony, bought flowers, stopped at the drugstore for eye drops. When she returned, she found her room open. Cleaning service. Things were moved, the bed was made, but something was wrong. Belle looked at her as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't. That night, Louise woke up to a strange sound, like claws sliding across the floor. She sat up. She called, "Belle?" Silence. She turned on the light. The room was empty. The emptiness tasted like metal. A lump in her throat. Panic didn't come suddenly, but like a wave. Slow, viscous, covering her completely. She ran out into the hallway barefoot, screamed, knocked on the doors. No one answered. No one came out. Another guy was sitting at the counter. He didn't know who she was. He said there were no cameras. He said the dog might have come out on its own. He said everything that people say who don't care. She went outside, without a coat, without thoughts, and walked through the snow, along the sides of the road, among the headlights. She looked for Belle, calling, praying, gasping for breath. Neither the wind, nor the shout of a passerby, nor someone's attempt to offer to call a mental hospital stopped her. She walked. Because otherwise, she was dying. But Belle did not answer. Louise sat on the edge of the bed as the morning sun filtered through the cheap blinds, cutting the room in pale stripes. Belle dozed peacefully at her feet, trembling in her sleep. It seemed like morning, the beginning of a new day, but inside, everything was clenching. As if intuition, that ancient instinct preserved in those who have lived their whole lives on guard, was whispering, "You are superfluous here." And she was right, because as soon as she went downstairs to get a cup of tea and see if anyone had found Belle, the looks began again. They were not looks of concern or sympathy. They were looks she had known since childhood. Irritation, contempt, impatience. She did not shout, did not complain. She just went up to the counter and politely asked if anyone had worked last night, if they had seen the dog. The guy with the fire tattoo was no longer sitting in his place. Instead, two girls and a guy in a jacket were standing behind the counter, and as soon as Louise approached, the conversation between them died down, as if the sound had been turned off. The girl with lipstick glanced at Louise and slowly crossed her arms, as if protecting herself. The guy leaned forward and asked with strained politeness, "Ma'am, are you in trouble?" Louise repeated her request again, trying to speak calmly, not to show her excitement. Everything inside her was clenched with pain, but she held on. The answer was cold. "No, no one found anything. We have no records of your animal. If you let it out on the street without a leash, we are not responsible." Louise almost choked on these words. Let it out? Without a leash? Belle never went far. She was trained, and she was her heart. But in those eyes, grey with a cold glint, there was neither sympathy nor understanding. Just tiredness from the fact that the wrong person is talking to them. As she turned away to go back to her room, she heard a muffled chuckle behind her and a whisper. "What is she doing here? Does she think we're a shelter or something?" Someone added, "She also has a dog as old as she is. Let him go to a flophouse." The words were not loud, but clear enough. She stopped. She turned around. No one was looking at her. Everyone was busy, working. But something cracked in the air. The fragile shell of silent dignity that she had held onto all her life cracked. She said nothing, only looked into the eyes of the one who was laughing, and saw emptiness. Directly above them, above the counter, hung a poster that read, "Every guest is welcome here." Below was a photograph of smiling staff. None of those standing in front of her were depicted in it. The poster was false. The smiles were a mask, and all that mattered here was skin color, age, weakness. A man appeared in the background, tall, in a sharp suit, with his hair perfectly done and a clipboard in his hands. Mr. Craig, the hotel manager. He walked confidently through the lobby until he spotted Louise standing at the counter, surrounded by a herd of staff. His face didn't move. He walked past. He slowed. He looked back. He smiled at her, the way waiters smile when they serve cold soup and pretend it's hot. "Miss, is everything okay?" he asked, without coming closer. She nodded. He nodded back and moved on, as if his part in the play was over. He didn't listen. He didn't bother to understand. He just made sure that everything looked okay. Returning to her room, she closed the door, stood in the middle of the room, and for the first time in a long time allowed herself, no, not to cry, to breathe, deeply, convulsively. The pain in her chest pounded like a hammer. Memories flooded her. How, in her youth, she was not allowed into cafes that did not serve blacks. How at work, she was forced to work 3 shifts because she was hardy. How on public transport, she was the last to be seated. She knew that look, that tone, that hoarse laugh behind her back. It had not disappeared in 70 years. It had only changed its form. Now it wore the uniform of the hotel. A couple of hours later, she still had to go back downstairs to ask where the nearest veterinary clinic was, in case someone had found Belle. But when she approached the counter, she was in for a surprise. This time, a different receptionist came out to her, an older woman with a serious face and an odd grin. "We are not a veterinary service, ma'am. We do not have the resources to search for your animals. Please do not distract the staff, and we cannot allow the animal to come back to other guests. If it does return, please keep it in the room. This is our last request." Louise felt the entire hotel, its walls, its lamps, the air, begin to press down on her like a slab. She did not scream. She did not complain. She just nodded and walked away. But as soon as she turned around, she heard the woman say to someone on the radio, "Yes, that's right, complaining. Again. Well, you know. Those people like to complain. Let him leave." These people. A word spoken like a bullet. Not a name. Not a guest. Not a woman. Just this. Not a person. Just an inconvenience. Louise went outside, even though the snow was getting heavier. She was shaking. She looked for the dog, holding a photo, looking hopeful, every movement questioning. People passing by looked away. One man told her to leave it and go back to her zone. Someone called her a homeless woman with a dog. A girl in pajamas filmed Louise screaming Belle's name in the snow on her phone and posted it with the caption, "Crazy old lady in our hotel, looking for an imaginary dog." The video got 200 likes in one evening. The comments were even worse. And that evening, she found a note on the doorknob of her room. Unsigned. "You and your dog are a disgrace. Leave before it's too late." The handwriting was neat. The paper was from hotel letterhead. She crumpled it, but inside she already knew. The hotel was not just not helping her. It was doing everything it could to push her out. Not directly, not rudely, but the way they do with those who spoil the view. Belle was still gone, and lying in the darkness, Louise understood. This place hated her, for who she was, for the very fact of her presence, and all she had was a few hours before she completely disappeared. Because people like her did not live in this hotel. They were simply erased. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments what city or country you are listening to our stories from. Have you ever had anything similar in your life? Have you encountered injustice, prejudice, or silent contempt? It is important for us to know how you perceive what is happening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the continuation. We continue. When Louise was first handed her keycard, the young man behind the desk glanced at the screen, then squinted as if checking something in his mind, and without further ado wrote down room 514 for her. "Top floor, ma'am. We're quiet there. Fewer guests." The words sounded neutral, almost solicitous, but there was something of a learned pattern in them. An unnatural politeness, a tension, as if he wanted to get rid of her as quickly as possible. Send her far away up, where she would not be seen. The elevator rose slowly, with a crackling sound. The 5th floor greeted her with dim light and a strange silence. Not the kind that gives peace, but the kind that sends a shiver down your spine. The hallway was a little shabby, the carpeting worn, with stains that no one had tried to paint over. The doors were slightly scratched here. The number plates were crooked, and the air seemed different somehow, musty, stale, with a hint of cheap deodorant and old smoke. As Louise walked down the hall, dragging her suitcase and Belle behind her, a face flashed from behind one of the doors, pale, with sunken eyes. It looked at her intently, without interest, but with something that was closer to dislike. and then disappeared again. She tried not to pay attention. Her number was at the very end of the hall. The key didn't work the first time. She put it in again, the lock clicked, and the door opened. The room was cramped, with a window that looked out onto the wall of another building. The air conditioner was old, and when it turned on, it hissed like it was releasing steam from a wound. Belle lay down next to the bed. Louise walked around the room. Everything was clean, but it felt like a cheap motel. Shabby furniture, an old microwave in the corner, a dusty TV screen. Fatigue pushed her onto the bed. She sank down, and as Belle curled up next to her, she thought, maybe she was just imagining things. Maybe fatigue was making everything worse. But in the evening, there was a knock on the door. The cleaning lady, young in a uniform with eye makeup and long nails. When Louise opened the door, the cleaning lady glanced at her, at the dog, narrowed her eyes and said, "I'm just checking. Are you staying for long?" The voice was not aggressive, but condescending, as if she were addressing a capricious child. "For 3 nights," Louise answered calmly. The cleaner nodded, but her gaze was frankly dismissive. She looked around the room as if looking for something suspicious. Then, without hiding her grin, she added, "We don't usually accommodate people like that here, but it happens." Louise didn't ask what exactly she meant, not because she didn't know, because she knew. It had all happened before. Looks, intonations, body language, they spoke louder than words. The next day began with someone knocking on the wall from the next room. It was loud and sharp. A few minutes later, there was another knock. When Louise went out into the hallway to see what was going on, a man of about 40, with a shaved head and torn jeans, came out to meet her. He looked at her, not hiding his disgust. "Are you bringing a dog?" he asked without greeting. Louise nodded. "I have allergies. They didn't tell me there would be dogs here. And the smell. Maybe you haven't noticed, but it stinks in here." I was going to complain. He looked at her as if she were dirt under his feet. She wanted to answer, but her throat was dry. He had already turned away, muttering, "First they let everyone in, and then they are surprised that there are no customers." She went back into the room, closed the door, and hugged Belle tightly. Belle licked her hand. The sounds continued behind the wall. Now the man was talking loudly on the phone. His words were clearly audible. "Yes, some old woman with a black dog. She seems to be sitting in a basement. I think she's mentally ill. I hope they throw her out." Louise sat pressed against the wall, hearing every word. Her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. She just breathed heavily and slowly, as if each inhalation was a struggle for a place in this world. Later, when she went down to the lobby to buy a bottle of water, she noticed that the elevator was taking longer than usual. It stopped at the 3rd, then the 4th, but when the doors opened, the teenagers standing in it, seeing Louise, laughed, looked at each other, and did not go in. One whispered to another, "They let anyone up there now." Another added, "They'll bring in fleas later." When the doors closed, Louise stood like a statue. Her hands were shaking. At the hotel store, the cashier counted the change twice, then put it on the counter without touching Louise's hand. A woman in an expensive coat stood nearby, and not hiding her irritation, she took a step back as Louise passed. The world around her did not scream. It hissed, approached, enveloped in a thin, sticky contempt that does not kill immediately, but gnaws from within, day after day. That evening, as she was returning to her room, she heard someone whispering in the hallway. 2 teenagers, the same ones who had been in the elevator, were standing by her door. One was holding a plastic bag. When they noticed her, one of them deliberately threw the bag at her feet. A piece of raw meat fell out. "For your dog," he said with a grin. The other laughed. Louise said nothing. She just bent down, removed the meat and walked past, trying not to show how her hands were shaking. They watched her go, and in their eyes there was that special mixture of youth, impunity, and vile strength, when you know that society is on your side, even if you are cruel. At night, lying on her bed, she listened to a door slamming somewhere behind the wall, someone turning on music, someone laughing, and then another knock, first one, then 2, then another. Someone walked past the door and threw something, a thin rustle like a piece of paper. In the morning she found it, crumpled, without signatures. On it was written, "You don't fit in, time to leave." A coffee stain spread across the paper, like a stain on a memory. She put it in her pocket, because she knew it was not the first and not the last. Here, on this floor, there was a law of its own. It was not written, not discussed, but it was clear. This floor is like the backyard of a hotel. Here they put those they want to hide, those who do not fit the picture, those who do not inspire a desire to leave a good review. Temporary workers lived here, former prisoners, people who had no options, and now, her, with an elderly body, black skin, and an old dog. In this kingdom of silent repression, she was a stranger twice, and Belle felt it. She lay down by the door, growled at the rustling, stood up with every step in the hallway. Because she knew, behind these walls there was more than just indifference. Behind them, real hostility. And until the door is double locked, until your eyes are closed with fear, there is only one thing to do. Wait. And hold on. Until the last. It was a little over 2 hours after Louise had returned to her room with a bag of cheap food and tried to get some sleep. Belle was dozing peacefully by the door, as she had always done since Louise had taken her in after a panic attack on a bus. The one where the driver had refused to help her and pushed her out at the bus stop, while people walked by pretended not to hear her screaming for help. Belle had been lying next to her on the wet pavement and had not moved. She had not moved since. But now, just as Louise's eyes were beginning to close, the phone rang, dry, demanding, urgent. Hotel service. The voice on the other end of the line was mechanically polite. "Mrs. Louise, you need to go down to reception. There has been a complaint from another guest. Urgent." She felt the tension tighten in her chest. What had happened? Belle did not bark. They didn't communicate with anyone. Her legs were shaking as she rode the elevator down. They were already waiting for her in the lobby. A receptionist with a badge saying Stephen, a woman in a uniform shirt, and a security guard in the corner, as if already anticipating a scene. Stephen looked at her like a school counselor at an errant student. "Ma'am, we have received several complaints about your dog. They say he is making noise, disturbing the rest, and someone noticed hair in the hallway. We must remind you that according to hotel rules, the animal must be in a carrier at all times when outside the room." Louise tried to speak calmly. She pulled a certificate out of her bag. She held it out, her hand shaking slightly. "This is Belle. She is a therapeutic. I have a medical certificate. She is with me for a reason. I can't." Her voice broke. Stephen didn't even look at the certificate. He took a step back, as if the paper could infect him. "It doesn't matter if she is disturbing others. This is not a clinic. This is a hotel. And we want everyone to be comfortable here." The woman in the uniform gave a false smile. "We understand, ma'am, but you know how it is. Guests complain, and others leave, and we can't afford to lose our reputation. If you can't control an animal, you might want to consider moving out." Louise stood, clutching the paper in her hands, watching as people passed by glanced at her. Some looked away. Some just stared. An old black woman, her shoulders slumped, in a threadbare jacket, protecting her dog like a child. Stephen stepped forward, his voice hardening. "If this happens again, we'll be forced to issue a written warning, and that may affect your ability to stay." "You're not listening," she whispered. "You're just not listening." He shrugged. "We hear everything, ma'am, and the complaints too." She turned, walking heavily, and walked back. The elevator felt like a cell. She stood inside, feeling the resentment suffocate her. She knew it wasn't about the dog. It was about her appearance, about her face, about being too old to be useful and too black to be safe. When she returned to the room, Belle jumped up happily, tail wagging. Louise dropped to her knees next to her, hugging her like a child. "They think you're in their way," she whispered into the animal's ear. "They don't know that you saved me, that you're the only one who still believes that I'm human." Someone walked past in the hallway outside, shuffling loudly on the carpet. Then a knock on the wall. The neighbor again. A few minutes later, a call. This time on the intercom. Reception again. "Ma'am, Please keep the dog quiet. There has been a new complaint. She didn't believe it. She was in the room. Belle had not made a sound. It was a lie. A terrible, deliberate lie that no one checked because no one needed to check. A complaint is a fact. Age, skin color, loneliness are a death sentence. She sank down on the bed. My head was pulsing. They want you to leave. And everything they did was aimed at precisely that, at displacing, at squeezing out, at isolating. In a world where you can no longer just say, "You're not suitable," you can now call on the phone with sour politeness and say, "There's been a complaint about you." Late that night, when she ventured out into the hall to heat up some food in the microwave, she saw a co-worker, the one with the tattoo, whispering something to a cleaning lady. They both turned around as she passed, and the girl chuckled, covering her mouth with her hand. Louise heard the guy say, "I'd be nervous too if I slept with a flea-ridden dog in room 514. She didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She just walked slowly, as if every word was a knife in her back. In the cafeteria, she tried not to make eye contact with anyone, but even in the silence, she felt like they were looking at her, as if she were a criminal, as if she had brought with her not a dog, but a disease. The face no one wanted to see was reflected in her bowl of soup. Later, returning to her room, she noticed that the door to her room was slightly open. Inside, there was a mess. Someone had come in. Someone had moved her bag, moved her slippers. There was wool on the pillow, but Belle was not on the bed. Someone was trying to fabricate evidence. She realized it right away, and it was worse than the insults. It meant that someone had already decided that she was an intruder, and now they were simply creating a pretext to cement it. She called down again, asked to speak to the manager. In response, the cold voice of the administrator. "He is unavailable. You can leave a complaint at the counter." At that moment, she felt herself falling. Not in her body, but in her soul. Everything that was bright in her, that held her up, hope, faith, stubborn dignity, cracked. She locked the door from the inside. She hugged Belle. And she never opened the door again to anyone's knock, because she knew that the next complaint could be the last. It all started with a sharp knock on the door. It was about 3 a.m, the time when even the most disturbing dreams give way to emptiness, and the world seems momentarily safe in its silence. Louise woke with a jerk, sitting up in bed. Belle growled at the door, the fur on the back of her neck standing on end. The knock came again, heavy, rhythmic, menacingly confident, as if it was not a hotel employee who was standing behind the door, but a person who had come to break her life. A voice rang out after the third knock. "Security, routine inspection." Louise froze, looking at the door. A routine inspection at 3 a.m. Her heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed to echo off the walls. Belle barked louder now, throwing herself at the door, protecting it. Louise threw on her robe, approached slowly, and without opening the door asked, "What do you want?" "No inspections have been announced." The voice became slightly irritated. "Open up. We have the right to check the premises. We have received information about a violation." She knew it was a lie. She knew it. Just as she knew that there had been no real complaints before. There had only been desires to remove her, push her out, get rid of her. But she still opened the door slightly, and immediately 2 men in black uniforms with the words "security" barged in, opening the door wider than necessary. One was tall, with a shaved head and a hand reaching for his belt. The other was younger, but with the same expression on his face, indifferent, cold, equal only to contempt. Belle growled and barked. The first guard stepped forward. "Quiet, dog. We're just doing our job." "She's a service dog." Louise tried to intervene, but her voice was weak, hoarse from sleep and fear. "And you, ma'am, please step out into the corridor. We'll inspect the room. Such measures are standard in cases of repeated complaints." "In a robe? Now? In the cold?" Louise was shaking. "Please cooperate, or we will have to call the police." The word police hit her like a slap. She knew what it meant. For a white woman, it was an inconvenience. For a black woman, it was a danger. She went out, into the hallway. The floor was cold. The air was icy. The door was slammed behind her. She was left standing in her robe, her grey hair disheveled, her hands pressed to her chest. Someone peered out of one of the doors. A teenager. He giggled. He clicked a phone. She heard someone say, "What? Are they catching someone again?" And another woman in a distant room muttered softly, "God, what a circus." The minutes dragged painfully long. She heard two people inside rattling furniture, moving things, opening a closet, as if they were looking for a reason. They pulled out every little thing so that they could later say, "Found a mess, things are scattered, the dog is out of control." Then the door opened. The first guard came out and, without looking into the eyes, said, "No violations were recorded, but the dog is too aggressive. Next time, if she shows aggression, even in defense, the catching service will be called. Take note and take action." She was protecting me. She barked because you broke in. Without permission, you had no right. Louise's voice broke, became higher, cracked. The guard shrugged. "We are just doing our job. And if you don't like something, you can always leave the hotel. Nobody is keeping you here. Nobody is keeping you. Nobody wants to. Nobody is calling." She stood there, nearly naked, shaking, humiliated, as two cleaning staff walked past, one of whom commented loudly, "More noise, and then they wonder why our ratings are falling." She walked into the room, closed the door, and fell to her knees, hugging Belle. Belle licked her face, whining. Louise felt her whole body shaking with tension. Her fingers were cramping. She was scared. More scared than she had been in years. Not because someone had hit her, but because the entire hotel, every square meter of it, had become an enemy. And worse, a trap. Webs woven from procedures, voices, formal rules, faces without eyes, and eyes without compassion. She knew that the next night could be her last, not because she would die, although that would be easier, but because the system she found herself in would, step by step, break her, and the dog, and everything she had left. Then the phone rang, already in the morning. "Miss, we must officially record that your dog is aggressive. The message has been sent to the administrative department. Expect notification." She was silent and hung up. This was not a hotel. This was the front, and she, with fragile bones and an old heart, with a dog and the truth, was left there alone. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you are listening to this story from. Have there been situations in your life when you faced humiliation or injustice, similar to what the heroine is experiencing? Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. Louise woke to a chill that hit her the moment she opened her eyes. Grey rays of morning light were streaming through the window, but the room was unusually empty. The familiar rustling sounds of Belle's light breathing, her soft growl as she tossed and turned, looking for a comfortable spot, were gone. Louise turned over, and her heart sank. The foot of the bed was empty. The dog was gone. Panic, silent and unexpected, gripped her ribcage. She jumped out of bed, looked at the floor, at the door. Belle was nowhere to be found. She ran to the window and glanced down, hoping to see a familiar figure, although she knew it was useless. Belle couldn't have left without her knowledge. Dogs didn't just disappear like that. Louise ran out into the hallway, screaming, but no one answered. The cleaning guy was standing at the window, frowning when he saw her. "What's wrong, missus?" he asked, not moving from the spot, but his eyes were already sparkling with restrained interest. She grabbed his shoulder. "Where is my dog? Where is Belle?" The man shrugged. "I don't know. We cleaned your room, but we didn't see the animal." Louise grabbed his hand and squeezed it. "What did you do to her?" Her voice became almost a whisper, but the guy pushed her hand away, as if it were contagious. "Mum, don't worry. If the dog ran out, we can't help." She tried to stop him, but he had already turned away and walked to the elevator without looking back. Belle was gone. Louise returned to the room, passing the reception, where a young girl with lipstick glanced at her briefly, but did not say a word. The cameras, as always, were not working. False goodwill. Mysterious technical malfunctions. A new administrator sat at the reception, already with an empty look. Louise took a step toward him, and his eyes immediately moved away from the monitor as she asked, "Where's my dog?" He answered without looking up, "What dog?" She felt her heart clench, but she continued, "Belle, she can't just disappear. She's a medical dog." He shrugged, again not looking at her. "We don't know. Maybe she ran outside. Maybe someone found her. Maybe she escaped." "She didn't escape," Louise repeated, her voice stronger, but the words sounding even more hollow. The receptionist answered without expression, "We cannot be responsible for animals that get out of the rooms. If she cannot stay in the room and abide by the rules, you need to consider eviction." Eviction. It wasn't just a phrase. It wasn't just words. She knew that this was actually an eviction. She wasn't being asked to leave. She was being pushed out, dragged out like evil, like something that shouldn't be here. She went to the elevator, her eyes no longer showing salvation, but loss. She couldn't understand where her dog was, but she knew for sure that she wouldn't find it in this place anymore. As usual, all the buttons in the elevator were occupied, except for the top floor. She pressed the button and went up to the top floor, to a room that was no longer her home. Thoughts flashed, tormented her like thorns. Where did she go? What happened? Why wasn't anyone helping? Why didn't anyone believe her? Did the dog get out on its own? Or was it just thrown out? The words began to sound like a sentence, but she couldn't believe it. She stood in front of the door, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. She couldn't understand how this could happen in this place, where she was supposed to be understood, where her life, her rights were protected. She opened the door. There was no trace of Belle inside. Everything was in order, like last time. But nothing was in its place. There was a strange smell, like scorched earth. The room was empty. It smelled of air that was not used to seeing light or stars. She felt a stone in her chest, squeezing her insides. No trace, no evidence. But no one was going to look. No one was trying. She went back into the hallway and again passed the counter without seeing anyone. As she passed, she heard a conversation in the background. The man she had bumped into this morning was talking to a colleague again. "You don't get it, do you? There's nothing we can do. She's not the only one. Can't you see? It's obvious. She should have moved a long time ago." The woman next to him smiled, looking at Louise. She looked at them, but didn't answer. Fear gripped her so she couldn't move. She didn't feel human. She didn't feel like a woman. She felt like rising dust thrown into the void, and she knew that in that void, no one was waiting for her. She lowered her head, sighed. Belle was gone, and with every step, with every glance, she was disappearing. This hotel had everything, but no place for her. Louise ran out into the street, not caring that she was wearing only slippers and a robe. The snow pricked her skin like tiny needles. The wind cut through her clothes, getting to the very bones. Belle, her protector, her last support, was gone, and the world around her, which had once seemed familiar, had become alien and cruel. She did not think about the fact that her clothes were out of season, that her hair was fluttering in the wind, and that her nose was bleeding from the cold. She walked down the street, clenching her fists, trying with all her might to believe that the dog would come back, that this was all a nightmare, and she would wake up with Belle by her side. But every step felt like a step into space. Cold, too cold. She did not know how long she had been walking, but when she stopped to catch her breath, her eyes were red and her breathing was ragged. The flash of rage and fear only intensified. She felt the snow soaking into her slippers, the mud crawling into her toes, but she kept going. There was no one along the road to help her. There were streetlights ahead, but they were so dim, so cold, that she felt neither their warmth nor their light. Only a feeling of emptiness. Passers-by, seeing her, immediately turned in the other direction. An old woman in slippers, with bare feet and a depressing look. Someone walked past with a phone in their hand. Someone walked with dogs, but no one stopped. She came to a corner where she noticed a couple of teenagers. One of them laughed when he saw her. He came closer and threw a snowball at her. It hit her right in the face and they both burst out laughing. "So, old woman, were you looking for a dog? Maybe you don't belong here." he said with a smile full of humiliation and mockery. Louise felt a wet patch of snow appear on her face. That was not what was bothering her. She stood there in complete horror, gritting her teeth, watching the teenagers laugh, realizing that they did not see her as a person. It was not so much a physical insult as a humiliation. But that was only the beginning. The teenager, clearly feeling his power in this situation, came closer and shouted, "Old black witch with a dog, what do you want from us?" His voice was sharp, biting. He came closer, spat at her feet, so that wet mud spread over her slippers. Louise froze. She felt her throat tighten. But in response to these words that seemed to pierce through her, she could not say anything. There were no words, no answer, only a bitter silence that deafened her. The teenager did not stop. "Look, you lousy old woman, you're going to die here," he continued. And the second teenager laughed even louder, grabbing his shoulder. "Are you sure you're from the streets? Who even let you in here? Do you think anyone will help you?" "Something terrible is missing, huh?" the second boy shouted. Louise felt tears starting to gather in her throat, but she forced herself not to cry. It was too humiliating. Her whole body was clenched and every step was torture. But she kept walking forward, trying to find Belle. She walked through the city, not seeing people, not hearing cars, not paying attention to how every gaze was directed at her, how she was bursting with pain and humiliation. Finally, she realized that she had wandered into a neighborhood she had never been to. Here the houses were old, abandoned, with peeling roofs and rusty pipes. People lived in these houses, but this was different. Ragged fences, garbage in the street, dumps everywhere. People looked at her with obvious displeasure, but no one came up to her. Only an old man at the door of one house said, "You don't belong here, Granny. Get out of here before it's too late." She turned and walked on. But how could she go back? Go back knowing that her dog, her only support, was gone. How could she go back to a place where they didn't believe her, where they humiliated her? At that moment, she became afraid. Not from the cold, not from the people. She was afraid that no one needed her, that the world around her was closed. Dirt scratched under her fingernails. Tears appeared in her eyes. Belle was her last support, her last love. She couldn't believe that she was gone, that her life was now just an attempt to find her. Suddenly, passing by the garbage bins, Louise heard a hoarse laugh that came up behind her. "What, Granny? Haven't found it yet?" said one of the boys, and Louise felt the air around her soul tighten again. "Are you completely crazy? Go on about your business before you get beaten up." They laughed and said that they would treat her like a dog, that she did not deserve help, did not deserve any attention. The whole world suddenly seemed so hostile to her, so alien and merciless. She stood in a crowd of people who saw her only as an old black woman, with all her problems and troubles, and not one of them could say a word of sympathy, could not help. Teenagers continued to shout at her from afar, and while she tried to distance herself, they continued to throw snowballs at her, and even shouted, "Soon they will throw you out, like your dog." All this was torn apart in her chest, and she continued to walk. She no longer thought about her name, did not think about who she was, did not think about the fact that her life had once been different. The only thing she felt was pain that she could no longer bear. She walked on, ignoring all the words, all the insults, because she could not stop. Belle had to be somewhere nearby, and she continued to look for her in this world that seemed hostile, uncomprehending, and cruel. Louise walked back to the hotel, feeling every cell in her body weaken. She was no longer looking for the dog. Her steps had become uncertain, heavy, almost like in a nightmare. Her whole life was now a night shadow, in which her last support was disappearing. Belle. She could not believe that she was gone, that there would no longer be that quiet growl in the night, soft paws that rose to her in the morning. The world was so cruel that she could not perceive that her beloved dog, the one who saved her, who was with her in the most terrible moments of her life, had simply disappeared. She thought that maybe she had been kicked out. Maybe someone had simply abandoned her on the street, because it was not allowed, because her dog was black, like herself. But she could not believe that it was that simple. When she approached the building, she was met by a strange sight. Near the hotel, there was a car of animal rights activists with flashing lights. She noticed several people huddled near the side of the road. Their faces were serious, and one woman, older than the others, was standing with a phone in her hands. Louise walked up to her, clenching her fists, and asked, "What happened? Have you seen the dog?" The woman turned to her, and her face reflected confusion. Were you looking for her?" she asked quietly, but her voice was heavy with some unknown pain. Louise could not continue. The woman nodded and stepped towards the car, opening the trunk. Belle was lying there, dead. The dog she loved and cared for, with eyes full of trust and fur that in recent days had turned grey, like her own hair. Belle had been hit by a car. The body looked as if she had not just been hit. She had been lying on the asphalt, abandoned like an object, without any care. Louise stood like a stone. She could not breathe. She could not move. She looked at her only being left in this world and understood that everything she had experienced was just a premonition. She felt an emptiness inside her, so strong that it seemed her heart would not bear it. The animal rights activist woman noticed her gaze and approached cautiously. "Sorry, but we received information from local residents. They said that they saw your dog being unloaded from a service van. She was simply abandoned on the street." Louise screamed as if she had been hit. It was so unfair that she did not have the strength to react. She stood there, barely understanding what was happening. "Throwed out?" she whispered, unable to believe it. The woman nodded. "Yes, they saw her being unloaded and simply driven away. They tried to help, but she did not live to see it." There was sympathy in her voice, but it could not absorb the pain that gripped Louise. She felt everything inside her crumble, her heart no longer beating normally. She felt a coldness creep into her soul, as the world around her ceased to exist. This wasn't just the murder of her dog. This was the murder of everything she loved. Louise began to tremble. Her hands began to shake, and she couldn't take her eyes off Belle's body. Belle, who had been her light. Belle, who had saved her, who had been her safety in this harsh, alien world. She stood there, exhausted, and the people around her, the ones who had tried to help, looked at her with pity, but they were helpless. The ones who could have helped, the ones who could have stopped this, had long since taken their eyes off her. This wasn't just a lonely moment of pain. This was the death of her only friend in this world. At this moment, several people were standing nearby, talking. "Well, isn't this funny?" one said. She didn't even notice that her dog had been thrown out. He laughed, and his laughter was cruel, like thunder. Louise felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced herself not to cry. "How could they?" she whispered softly, in disbelief. Someone else came up and said, "Well, she shouldn't have come here. Look, an old black woman with a dog. Is there a place for that?" They all stood around her, as if to demonstrate that her pain was an act of insignificance. Belle had been her last connection to this world, but now she was gone, and Louise's world came crashing down. As soon as her eyes laid eyes on the dog lying dead on the pavement, everything else became unimportant. Louise went to the body, bent down, held her close, feeling the cold that emanated from what was left of her dog. But nothing could bring her back, and no one could take away her pain. She sat there on the cold pavement, feeling the world crumble inside her, and the angry looks, spitting and laughter of people passing by meant nothing anymore. She understood that her dog was not just dead, it was murdered, and she was killed along with it. This was not just an accident, this was an act of violence. The violence was not in how the dog was killed, but in the fact that it was simply thrown away like an old toy. Louise could not get up. Her legs did not obey her. She could not allow herself to get up, because she knew that this moment would stay with her forever. She had lost everything. She had lost Belle, the last of those who had ever loved her, and this world that she once considered hers was not hers. It was alien, hostile, full of pain and contempt. In that moment, she realized that she no longer existed in this world, a world that killed those who were weaker and did not stop even at the most defenseless. She continued to sit on the cold asphalt, and no one came. But she could no longer face this world. Belle was gone, and with her departure, the last trace of her dignity was gone. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you are listening to this story from. Have there been moments in your life when you had to face cruelty and injustice, similar to what the heroine experiences? Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. Louise sat on her bed, her phone in front of her, the same one she had used to try to find traces of her dog, the same one she had used to receive ridicule and humiliation in the comments. It was her only link to this world, which had become alien and hostile. She no longer believed in the possibility of justice. Belle was dead, and with her death, something in Louise had gone too. But there was one thought left, one last attempt to be heard, even if it fell into the void. She couldn't just remain silent. She couldn't leave all this without trying to tell at least one truth. Her fingers froze when she touched the screen. She flipped through the pages. She typed in the words, images of the hotel, the smiles of the employees, the dismissive glances. The reproaches kept spinning in her head over and over again. It was all like a continuous stream of dirt. And no one was listening to her. Someone was constantly interfering, not letting her finish her sentence. Louise picked up the phone and started writing. She didn't know what would come of it, didn't expect anyone to read it, but the words were already coming, no matter how much she didn't want to write them. I came here to spend my last days with my sister. I came because I had nowhere to go, and I thought that at least this place would be calm. I chose this hotel because it looked decent, because it was in the city center, and I just needed to survive a few days. I was calm, and I thought that here we would not be affected by the world in which I always felt like an outsider. But from the very beginning, I felt like something was wrong. The first glances, it was clear to me that I was not welcome here. My face, my skin, my accent, all of this irritated me. I saw how people exchanged glances when I entered, how the hotel staff avoided me, how they gave me a room on the highest floor, as if I did not deserve a normal place. But I thought it was just my fears and everything would be fine. My dog Belle was my only friend. She helped me survive the horror of loneliness. She was always there when I felt lost. I always thought she would be there, even if everything else fell apart. And then, on the very first evening, I felt that something was wrong. My dog was barking because she was locked in the room, like in a cage. My neighbors began to complain, although Belle was not howling. She was just there, with my old heart, which could no longer cope with the pain of loneliness. But no one listened to me. When I complained, I was told that the animal had to be in a carrier, and if I could not control her, I could be evicted. But she was not just a dog. She was a therapy animal, and without her, I would not have survived. It was not a matter of habit, it was a matter of life. But no one listened. I was kicked out. I was thrown out of this hotel like unwanted trash. I stood in the hallway, hurt and alone, my soul empty. No one came to my aid. Everyone looked away, but the worst thing was that I had lost Belle. I knew she wasn't allowed to stay. So I looked for her. I walked the streets like crazy, trying to find the dog I'd had for almost 10 years. And then, a few days later, they told me she'd been found, dead, hit by a car. And they said she'd just been thrown out of the car like an old thing. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand how it could be so cruel. How could the dog that saved my life be such a victim? They threw her out because she was with me. Because I was a black woman who came here with an animal. I didn't deserve anything. I wasn't listened to. I was thrown out. My dog was dead. And I was left alone. Louise paused. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She looked at her writing. Words couldn't express everything she'd been through. Everything she'd written was nothing, but it might have been her last chance to be heard. She pressed send, and she felt like her life wouldn't change. Nothing would change, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. She wrote, "You killed my last friend." Comments appeared on the screen. Some people simply liked her post. Some wrote words of sympathy. But there were also those who couldn't pass by. Someone wrote from afar, "Stop complaining, Grandma. It's your own fault you were walking down the street with a dog." Someone else replied, You went to a hotel like that, with an animal like that, and you're still complaining. Didn't you realize that you weren't welcome here? Someone else added from afar. A black old woman with a dog. It's okay that she was kicked out. Those words cut her again. This wasn't just humiliation. This was a label that had been stuck on her since birth. She went back to her room and closed the door again. This was her world now. A world without Belle, without any hope. A world where she was just an old black woman who couldn't even find a place for herself anymore. But she knew that at least her words had been heard. It might not change anything, but they were true, at least for someone. And that was enough. At first, it was a quiet whisper that gradually became louder. People started sharing her post. First just acquaintances, then friends, then those who saw the story and wanted to do something. And despite all her doubts that it would be nothing, Louise's post, like her words, fell on the world with such force that no one could ignore it. In the first hours after publication, posts with the hashtags Justice for Belle, racism, and abuse began to gain popularity. People began to write and share. Activists who had fought for animal rights and against racism all their lives picked it up and spread it with unprecedented speed. The story, which began as a personal tragedy for Louise, turned into an angry storm that engulfed the entire internet. People could not stand aside when they learned that the dog was simply kicked out, and its owner was humiliated and kicked out, ignoring her rights. Thousands of people began to post photos of their support. The hashtags grew in popularity. The entire social network began to talk about Belle. Soon, articles appeared in major news outlets, raising questions not only about animal cruelty, but also about systemic racism and disregard for the rights of black people. It was not just a word, it was a protest. A protest against what Louise had gone through, a protest against everything that was happening to her dog. And these voices grew stronger. Activists and animal rights activists, who had previously remained silent, began to openly declare their actions. They found documents and evidence that the hotel had repeatedly ignored complaints from other guests about racist behavior by employees. But everything was hidden, hushed up, disappeared into the shadows. Soon, information appeared that the cameras that the hotel staff said were not working were actually on, and that the video from the cameras recorded how the dog was thrown out into the street, abandoned there as if she were nothing more than trash. The video they tried to hide became the most powerful piece of evidence. The news was filled with images of Louise standing outside her room, holding Belle's collar in her hands, tears streaming down her face. These images became a symbol of injustice, an image of all the pain and humiliation she had experienced. The trauma was so deep that her story became a challenge that people could not help but respond to. On TV screens, in newspapers, on social media, every day people posted their photos with hashtags expressing protest. Some held signs that read, "Black Lives Matter." Some posted photos of their pets, supporting Belle. The images of Louise's tears became a symbol of the fight for justice. People began to ask questions. Why was this woman humiliated like that? Why was her dog thrown out on the street like an object? Why did the hotel staff allow themselves to do this? Why was the world as a whole so cruel and indifferent to the pain of one person? Among the supporters were many black activists who spoke out about systemic racism, not only in the public consciousness, but in all walks of life, from services to work to relationships. They demanded punishment for those involved in the tragedy of Louise and Belle. They screamed for truth and justice. And even though they knew it would be a long road, they believed it was the only way to awaken awareness. But other voices also arose. Voices who believed that Louise deserved all of this. Voices that tried to justify the actions of the hotel staff and those who had been indifferent. Some wrote that Louise was simply not fit for such a hotel, that her place was somewhere elsewhere, far from such good areas. Some openly called her a brazen old woman who did not understand how proper people behaved in society. Some even claimed that Belle herself could have been the cause of all this trouble, and if she hadn't been a dog, maybe things would have been different. These comments, despite their small number, penetrated the very nests of unkind thoughts. In this dirty part of the world, racism and prejudice seemed to never end. But the answers came from where people were not afraid to speak the truth. People who supported Louise and Belle wrote about their experiences, about how they had to fight injustice and violence, about how they felt like strangers in this world. Louise's posts were not only her personal tragedy, but also the voice of thousands of people who had been silent for years. Anger and grief overwhelmed everyone, and this anger was a force, a powerful force that broke the silence. Videos appeared of people coming to the hotel, demanding an apology. Marches were held in the streets dedicated to animal rights and the fight against racism. All these protests, this fire, this furious protest rose in the air, capturing everything around. And despite the hotel's attempts to suppress it, the information continued to spread. Several days passed. Louise sat at home. She watched what was happening. But there were no tears or hope in her eyes anymore. There were only words that now worried her and were something she could share. And those who heard her began to hear others. At that moment, she understood that her pain was not only hers, that her story had become part of something more important. It was not just a demand for justice for the death of her dog. It was a demand for justice for all those millions of people the world does not notice. Those who were subjected to cruelty and humiliation simply because of their skin. And her story, her tears, her last words, they became a signal to fight. You killed my last friend. These words became the cry of thousands of hearts that had experienced similar pain. Words that could not leave anyone indifferent. And now they were part of a huge force that was moving forward. For Louise, this was not a return, not the restoration of justice. It was a collision with reality, with the one she would have to live. But at least now, at least for a moment, she felt that her pain had not gone into the void, that her words mattered. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you are listening to this story from. Have there been situations in your life when you encountered injustice or humiliation similar to what the heroine experiences? Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. Several weeks had passed since Louise had published her post. Her words had not disappeared into the void, as she had feared. Instead, they had become part of a furious thunder that was growing louder and louder in the world. People could not forget Belle, could not forget the cruelty with which she had been thrown out onto the street, could not forget how her death had only been the culmination of the merciless treatment of a person who had already been humiliated. And then, suddenly, the first revelations began to emerge. That evening, as the news showed another report on the protests surrounding Louise's story, a new figure appeared on the horizon. A former employee of the hotel whom Louise did not know. A man with a pale face and nervous eyes sitting in a cafe told his version of events. He began by saying that the hotel was not so bad, but then his eyes darkened, and he said, "I saw it all happen. The order to throw the dog out came from the manager himself. He said that if we didn't teach people like her the rules, we would pay the price." The man paused and added, looking down, "He said that a dog was just an accessory, and to set an example, we were told to leave her outside." He spoke quietly, but every word he said felt like a blow. There was no justification in his eyes. He knew he had done something wrong, and that fear was still with him. Louise listened, feeling her heart squeeze with pain again. Everything she had been through seemed to become even more cynical and cruel. She had always known that her dog had been thrown out, but now, with this admission, the world she was in revealed its darkest corners. This was not an accident. This was not a mistake. This was a decision. A decision that could not have been made if not for the contempt for her existence, for her skin, for who she was. And now, as people began to learn the truth, more evidence began to emerge. Anonymous messages, photographs of hotel employees taking part in the events. One of them sent Louise a copy of an email in which the hotel manager wrote to his staff that the dog needed to be isolated and showed her place because people like her should not be in a hotel that caters to decent people. This was not just bias, it was deliberate humiliation. With each passing day, the evidence became more and more obvious, but the real story was yet to come. Footage from the cameras that the hotel claimed were not working was emerging. This video they had tried to hide was finally available, and it showed everything. The video clearly shows Louise and Belle entering the room, the receptionist calmly checking documents and even smiling, until the moment when the first conflict begins, when Belle starts barking. Then you can see the hotel staff discussing how the dog should be kept in a cage because her presence is a violation of the norms and order. But the worst part started when they closed the doors. The camera captured one of the hotel employees, a man with a tattoo on his neck, walking down the hallway and peering into Louise's room. He whispers something to his partner and finds an opportunity to enter the room when the door is not locked. He pretends to be looking for something, but in reality, he takes Belle and hides her in the closet. It was a terrifying sight. Belle, who could not be anything other than a loyal and kind dog, was locked in a tiny closet for several hours, while her owner, unaware, searched for her around the hotel. From the moment the camera captured it, everything became clear. The hotel was not just trying to make Louise leave, they were trying to completely ignore her presence, humiliate her to the point that her dog became the object of their ridicule. This was not just an incident. This was deliberate humiliation, deliberate violence. When the footage was released to the public, the anger of the people reached its peak. The protests grew, and now that everyone had seen what was happening behind the scenes, they could not believe their eyes. Someone posted footage of the hotel staff laughing, mocking, discussing Louise, her age, her skin color, her presence in their nice hotel. The laughter became further proof that racism and contempt thrive in the most unexpected places. But with this scandal, other equally important facts began to emerge. People began to share their stories, stories that also lacked justice. Women who were refused service in stores, men who were thrown out of parking lots simply because they were black. Louise's story became a symbol of the fight against racism and disrespect for the lives of people who society sees as unbecoming. Several days passed. The anger did not subside. The protests continued. And then the hotel decided to issue an official statement. But their apology was not sincere. They offered to return the money to Louise and her partners, but this could not replace what had been done. The apology sounded like an empty formality, and instead of admitting their guilt, they began to accuse Louise of going too far and creating a conflict that they could not control. But they did not take into account one thing: the truth could no longer be hidden. This was not just a story about how one woman lost her dog. This was a story about how society views those who are different from the norm, and how these people become targets for those who, using their power, decide who is worthy of respect and who is not. The protests continued, and with each passing day, Louise felt her words gaining power. Power is in making people listen. And though the hotel tried to evade it, the reality was inexorable. They could no longer hide from their actions. Louise had lost Belle, but she had not lost her power. The story of Louise and Belle was more than just a cry of pain. It was a signal to anyone who had ever felt left out, and it was heard. The next day, Louise woke up to a strange silence. The usual noise of the city did not wake her. She was lying in her room, looking out the window, where the cold rays of the morning sun pierced the void like knives. In her mind, she tried to find Belle again, but she was gone. And more importantly, what life had given her was gone. Justice. She sat on her bed, thinking about how to turn the page. But when her hands touched the phone, a messenger appeared on the screen. A message from one of the activists she had been communicating with. The hotel is closed. That's it. The owner has fled. There is nothing on the website. The sign has been taken down. The cameras are gone. Louise could not believe her eyes. These words made no sense. How could something so significant disappear overnight? How could a hotel that was in the city centre suddenly just close? She stood up and went to the window. The sign was gone. The clear glass that had once told her she could rest when her soul needed peace now looked like an empty frame, meaningless. She caught a glimpse of a group of people near the entrance, discussing something. Some were filming. She nodded to one of the passers-by who passed by, and she saw a picture of an empty sign flash on his phone. Closed forever. It had become more than just a symbol. It had become her punishment. Just one day, and this hotel, where she had endured so much humiliation and pain, was gone, as if it had never existed. Mr. Craig, who had been the director, had disappeared with it. His name and photos had disappeared from all the news, all his connections had ceased, and the hotel that was supposed to serve people was now a ghost that had vanished into thin air. She knew that he would leave, that he might have hidden, that his power was gone, but more importantly, she knew that now she would never be given back what she had lost. No one could bring back her dog. No one could bring back her lost honor. Louise decided to leave the room anyway. As she was leaving the hotel, she noticed in passing another protest breaking out. People were standing at the entrance, waving placards and shouting, "For justice!" and "The hotel must be punished." Louise paused for a moment, feeling a heavy feeling that wouldn't go away. But she didn't go any further. She knew that justice was no longer possible for her. She walked past, without looking back. She understood that this hotel wasn't just a place where she found refuge. It was a place that had destroyed her. It was part of a world that didn't want to hear her, didn't want to see her. She couldn't believe that she would end up back in this city that was trying to erase her. But she decided to move forward. All she felt at that moment was a mixture of pain, anger, and disappointment. This city could have been her home, if only it hadn't been so cruel. This hotel could have been her last refuge, if only he hadn't thrown her out and thrown her dog out. But justice, no matter how much she screamed, no matter how much she begged, never came. And no matter how hard Louise tried, no one could bring her back. People's anger wouldn't bring her back. Protests wouldn't bring her back. She had lost everything, but despite that, she wasn't going to give up. There was a fire in her eyes that wouldn't go out. It was the fire that was there when she decided to look for her dog after losing everything. It was the fire that was there when she decided to write that very post. It was the fire that burned inside her because she still believed that the world could change. But that wasn't true for her. For her, the world had become a place that had taken away her last chance. She felt like her fight would never be won. That fight had already taken everything she held dear. But she still walked, even if she wasn't seen. Louise stood at the hotel door, looking at the sky that had always been the same to her, but now seemed too far away. The evening was growing cold, and her steps were uncertain. She was walking into the void, where all she had was her own pain. Pain she couldn't put into words. Pain no one understood. She had lost Belle. She had lost the place that had been her home, at least for a time. And now she was walking into a world that had no place for her. There was no hope, no justice. All she had left were bitter memories and a post that could never bring back what she had lost. And this world was the same. Merciless. Cruel. Louise didn't look back, didn't seek support. She walked down the street and the world was empty. But at least she knew one thing. Her words had not been lost in the void. They had been heard. Even if the world had not changed, at least those who could understand her had heard the truth. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? It is very important for us to know your opinion, as each of you is incredibly important to us. We appreciate everyone who stays with us, who supports and shares their experiences. Please do not forget to subscribe and like if you liked it. And so that we know that you listened to the end, write in the comments the phrase, "Justice is important for everyone." We wish to you good day and thank you for yours attention.